Okay, good morning everybody. Can everybody hear me down the back? Okay. Well, good morning everyone. My name is Cormac Behan. I'm the chair of the Progress in the Penal System Advisory Group, and I'll be chairing today's session. You're all very welcome to the launch of our 2022 report, Progress in the Penal System, a Framework for Penal Reform. Before I introduce our speakers and begin proceedings, I'd like to share some housekeeping with you. As you see, there's a photographer and a videographer are present today to record the event, which will be put up on the IPRT website and YouTube. So at this stage, if anybody has any concerns about this and has not yet raised it with a member of staff, please let one of the IPRT staff, who may indicate who they are, know, and as soon as possible, please let us know. So there'll also be sharing of personal experiences today. And accordingly, we ask people to be respectful and particularly not to post online any sensitive or identifying content regarding what is said during the panel discussion. That said, where people are sharing more general content related to the event, you can tweet hashtag PIPS 2022 or tag at IPRT on Twitter or at Irish Penal Reform Trust on Instagram or Facebook to join in the conversation online. There will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions at the end of the panel discussion. And as you may have seen from, we have a very full and varied agenda. So I would appeal to each and every speaker to stick closely to their allotted time. This event is due to finish at 12:20 today with a light lunch served afterwards, to which you're all invited. And as part of our push to be more environmentally friendly, a hard copy of the report is not available to everybody. However, summaries of the recommendations are available, as you've seen, in hard copy for all attendees. The full report, as I looked earlier this morning, is now on the IPRT website and it's been emailed to all attendees this morning before the event started. So, to open today's event, I'd like to introduce His Honour Judge Paul Kelly, President of the District Court. A graduate of University College Dublin and Northumbria University, Judge Kelly established a successful legal practice as a solicitor before his initial appointment to the District Court in 2010. And then, in March 2021, Judge Kelly was nominated to his current position as President of the District Court. So I'd like to ask you to welcome Judge Kelly to introduce our launch today.
Well, good morning. I'm taken by surprise by the biographical details, but I'm pleased that you've taken the trouble to research. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you this morning and also for facilitating me by allowing me to speak early in the programme. I want to apologise for that. I had previously had commitments that would have prevented me from remaining here, and I asked to be allowed to speak early, and I've now managed to readjust things, so I am actually going to stay with you for the rest of the conference, so I have jumped the queue and I apologise for that. At the outset, I want to commend the work of the IPRT in producing the PIPS report annually since 2016. They are a valuable resource in examining the work of the penal system and its effects on the prison population. Its warts and all scrutiny of the penal system ensures that any shortcomings are laid bare for the public, as well as legislators, international bodies and the judiciary, while the positive developments are acknowledged and suggestions for improvement articulated cogently. I fully endorse the comments in the report which highlight the problems of overcrowding, conditions within prison, lack of mental health and addiction services, difficulty for children and families of prisoners, and the particular issues affecting women prisoners. As the report says, we are a small, wealthy country and should work towards becoming a leading model of best penal practice. Other speakers will parse and analyse the statistics set out in the report and highlight the reforms needed, and no doubt question the actions of me and my colleagues across all jurisdictions in continuing to send people to prison, either on remand or to serve sentences. I will make some brief comments from the point of view of the judiciary about the alternatives to custody, many of which are strongly urged in the report. But first I have to challenge some of the assumptions on which the report is premised. There's a heading here, over-reliance on custody, which runs through the report. I and all of my colleagues, despite what one might deduce from reading the report, always operate on the basis that imprisonment is a last resort. I go so far as to suggest that we do not need legislation to tell us this. It is simply a given for any judge, particularly those on the district court. When a district court judge imposes a prison sentence, you will usually find that it has been done after all other sentencing options have been tried. It is extremely rare for a district court judge to impose a prison sentence on a person the first time they appear for sentence in the district court. Charitable donations, binding to the peace, probation bonds and supervision, fines, community service, suspended sentence and restorative justice. These are examples of a graduated approach used daily by judges before custody is considered. You will generally find that a person sentenced to jail has been given most or all of those options in the past, often on many occasions, before the hammer finally drops and the prison door opens. It is unfortunate but true that in many cases a judge has no other options open to him or her. Let me give you a couple of typical real-life examples from my experience in the district court over the past 13 years. A woman who was a prolific shoplifter, frequently caught, always pleaded guilty, but who wrought havoc in almost every shop, large and small, in a provincial town over several years. She often reoffended on her way home from court, having been released on bail or with a non-custodial disposal. All of the above options were tried with her repeatedly, but she simply could not pass a shop without stealing something. After a couple of years, during which I said to her that she was in court as often as I was, I felt I had no option but to sentence her, if for no other reason than that the shop owners needed a break from her offending. She served her sentences and went straight back to her old ways and continues to appear before the courts. Prison hasn't deterred her, but nor have any of the other options. Or take the serial, dangerous, uninsured drivers who appear, are fined, sent to driver re-education programs, given community service, suspended sentences and disqualifications, but who continue to re-offend. What does the judge do then? How would you feel if a member of your family was killed or injured by him after being released from court yet again with a non-custodial disposal? I could go on with many similar examples, but the point is that the judge has to consider not only the needs and challenges of the offender, but the protection of the community and the interests of the victims. There are no victimless crimes. To aspire to custody as a last resort is not the same as saying we should not send people to prison. None of us likes doing it, and we bend over backwards not to do so if we can avoid it. But we have a responsibility to the community and to individual victims, which we must in each case balance against the needs of the offender. I make these points to provide a context to the use of non-custodial options, of which I personally am a big fan. In my years on the bench, I have very rarely sentenced people to custody. I could go for months on end without imposing a custodial sentence. I have been unable to obtain from the Irish Prison Service figures for the number of prisoners detained solely due to sentences imposed by the district court. Many prisoners are serving sentences from the central or circuit court along with district court sentences. It's a frequent phenomenon that offenders who are already serving sentences imposed by higher courts will plead guilty to a number of district court offences on the basis that their sentence will be rolled up and incur no further jail time. But on the 30th of April 2023, there were 4,567 people in Irish prisons, of whom 574, or 15.4%, were serving sentences solely from the district court. In 2021, the last year for which figures are available, the district court imposed fines for 52,307 offences, community service for 1,093 offences, probation orders, that is community-based sanctions, for 11,143 offences, and imprisonment or detention for 7,561 offences. In most of those cases, an offender would have been dealt with for more than one offence. This means that roughly 10% of cases in the district court resulted in custodial sanctions. To touch briefly on the preferred options, as repeatedly urged in the report, namely community-based sanctions. These broadly comprise probation orders where the offender is required to remain under the supervision of the probation service, who are the unsung heroes in the Irish justice system, and to comply with various conditions, for example, attend addiction treatment, anger management, or education and training, and also community service. Any judge will tell you that there are serious constraints with these relating to shortage of probation officers to prepare reports and to actually do the supervision, shortage of sites for community service. Usually these are local community organisations or businesses who agree to take on offenders to carry out work, And in rural areas, transport poses a major problem for community service. Offenders are frequently reliant on lifts or poor public transport. Physical and mental health issues can prevent an offender from being capable or suitable for doing community service, as can addiction. That said, community service is working well. In 2021, 203,306 hours of community service work were completed in lieu of 713 years in prison, resulting in over €2 million worth of unpaid work for the benefit of communities. That's courtesy of the Probation Service Annual Report of 2021. Despite interruptions of COVID restrictions in 2021, towards the latter half of the year, community service, quote, continued to deliver positive social, economic and environmental impact on towns and communities across the country. €80,335, this is according to the IPRT, is estimated to be the cost of keeping a person in prison for a year. So by my calculation, community service also saved the state €57,278,855 in 2021 through the use of community service. I've just this month participated in a review being carried out by the Department of Justice into community service. I'm pleased to say that 15 of my colleagues are doing likewise as we speak. We would warmly welcome any increase in the availability of community service as a sentencing option, and we will not be shy about using it. However, there is a job of work to be done in educating the public to accept that community service, and indeed other community-based sanctions, are more than just a slap on the wrist or a soft option, as many commentators would have us believe. And on the bus on the way in this morning, I was reading the Journal article on the PIPS report that was published today, and you just have to look at the comments to understand what I mean by that. Restorative justice is another option in which I am particularly interested. Its use and availability leave much to be desired. The programme for government includes an aspiration to increase the use of restorative justice, but this is an extremely resource-intensive measure. Only 413 referrals to restorative justice were made in 2022. That's down from 721 in 2019. The number and proportion of restorative cautions for young offenders has also decreased. It is unfortunately my experience that victims are frequently reluctant to engage with restorative justice, despite significant evidence worldwide that outcomes for victims where restorative justice is used are much more favourable. All of us need to do much more to promote and explain restorative justice and its benefits. There are, I believe, 3 projects around the country offering restorative justice services to the courts, and the probation service is working towards extending their use of it. But investment, education and support services are required to enable restorative justice to be available to every court in the country. Dr. Ian Marder, who's here today, the acknowledged expert in restorative justice, has recommended a new legal requirement to make a pre-sentence offer of restorative justice, which he believes, quote, could greatly increase take-up and create a more participatory and harm-focused default approach to sentencing, and I support such a move. The same can be said of the Drug Treatment Court. It was set up in Dublin as a pilot project in 2001, and 22 years later it is still operating as a pilot project in Dublin. There is a smaller one operating in Dundalk and one in Limerick, but given the extent of the drug problem and the increases in crime deriving from it, surely the case for a significant ramping up of drug treatment courts is unanswerable in 2023. I would suggest that there should be, at the very least, a fully resourced drug treatment court in each of the cities and large towns. I recently attended a conference in London on problem-solving courts, for example, drug treatment courts, alcohol treatment courts, domestic violence courts, mental health courts, where the focus is on addressing the problems underlying criminal behaviour. The stories I heard were inspiring and uplifting and showed how a different approach can work. They are hugely resource intensive and require buy-in from law enforcement agencies as well as judges. But their long-term benefits for offenders, victims and society as a whole are enormous. The Irish judiciary, and district court judges in particular, will not be found wanting in using these tools if and when they ever become available to us. And I urge all of you here today to use whatever influence you have with the powers that be to help us reduce the number of people that we send to prison. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Kelly, for some very interesting and incisive points that I'm sure will be dealt with by Pamela and throughout the course of our discussions. So next, I'd like to introduce Pamela Drumgoole to introduce some of the key findings of the Progress in the Penal System report. Pamela has led and authored the report being launched today. Pamela began her work in IPRT as the Policy and Research Coordinator in November 2022, but previously she spent 5 years working in various positions within IPRT, including leading the organisation's campaigning and public relations work as a communications officer and a campaigns officer. So I'd like to introduce Pamela now.
Thank you, Cormac, for the introduction, and it is a tough act to follow following Judge Kelly, so I'm going to ask you all to just bear with me for 15 minutes. So I'm delighted to be here to present Progress in the Penal System 2022, or PIPS as it has become known to us. I'm even more delighted to be able to do so in a room full of people who are so invested in seeing the vision of PIPS materialised and who have the ability to deliver on that vision. So thank you all for joining us this morning. So what I'm going to do today is talk you through very briefly what PIPS is and the approach we took to PIPS this year before I move on to some of what we learned about the operation of the penal system this year. I'm going to focus on 3 specific PIPS standards and then I'll leave you with some final reflections. So while many of you, I suspect, will be very familiar with PIPS, for anybody who isn't, I'm going to give you a very condensed 3-sentence description of what it is. So PIPS was established in 2016, originally intended as a 3-year project, designed to do exactly what it says on the tin, track progress in the penal system. IPRT developed 35 standards based on international human rights and best practice, from which developments would be tracked with the expectation that over time we would not just meet these standards but exceed them. In short, PIPS has created and maintained a system where the national situation in the penal system is independently tracked and analysed on an annual basis. As Cormac has said, you'll all have received a digital copy of the report this morning, but you'll hopefully have a summary document in front of you, and if not, let one of my colleagues know and they'll drop one down to you. So moving on to the approach we took then to PIPS 2022. So this edition of PIPS focuses on 28 of the 35 standards. So this was for several reasons, but the largest deciding factors in this were internal capacity and challenges with accessing information. This edition places a detailed spotlight on women in the penal system, and this was informed by group sessions with women who were at various stages of contact with the criminal justice system, and we are incredibly grateful to those women for inviting us into those conversations. In previous editions of PIPS, we relied on specific metrics called indicators to benchmark progress. However, this report removes these indicators, and the reason for this is because over time, some of the indicators were no longer timely, and in some instances, it was very challenging to find data under the indicators, so the information was very sparse. And then finally this year, where possible, we have assigned 1 key action per standard to narrow the focus of the stakeholders to the areas that we believe are most in need of development. So before I move on to looking at the standards and the assessments, I just want to acknowledge on behalf of IPRT the continued openness and engagement by all of the stakeholders in this project. For another year, state agencies have been incredibly helpful with providing data to us where it isn't already publicly available. However, challenges with accessing quality and up-to-date data remain the biggest barrier to the production of PIPS on an annual basis. It would be much easier for IPRT and for the stakeholders involved if greater levels of data were made publicly available. In some cases, great work is already happening in collecting and maintaining this data, but it's not being regularly published. So moving on to the assessments, the bits that everybody waits for every year. This year, of the 28 standards we assessed, we have rated 4 as progress, 5 as regress, 8 as mixed, 9 as no change, and in 2 cases there was insufficient data to make a comprehensive assessment. You can see an overview of the standards that received each rating in your summary, but given the time this morning, I'm going to look at 3 select standards just to give you a bit of an insight into PIPS 2022. Where IPRT sees progress towards the vision of PIPS, we are very happy to call it out and to encourage it. In 2022, one example of this was in Progressive Penal Policy, Standard 1. There were a few highlights under this standard in 2022. For example, the Department of Justice's vision for penal policy in the years ahead was consolidated in the review of policy options for prison and penal reform. The review identified 6 priority policy areas designed to reduce reoffending, support assistance, avoid overcrowding in prisons, and reduce reliance on custodial sanctions, as Paul Kelly spoke about earlier. It also contained an additional focus on areas such as developing restorative justice, another shout out to Ian, I suppose, when he's here, and expanding access to spent convictions, and this was very much welcomed by IPRT. 2022 also saw the publication by the Department of Justice of its first ever criminal justice sectoral strategy, and this strategy is designed to develop a shared vision of a more joined up criminal justice system, which is very much welcomed by us. And particularly in this strategy, we really welcomed a focus throughout on the collection and use of data. Finally, the final report of the high-level task force on mental health and addiction was also published in 2022. While the recommendations in this report are explored in more detail under Standard 13, it would be remiss not to discuss them here as well because of the relevance of this report to progressive penal policy. Keeping people who can be better supported elsewhere out of the penal system or out of the criminal justice system entirely would be a significant step in Irish penal policy and would have huge impacts on the delivery of services and access to services in the penal system. Aside from these big developments in the areas of penal policy, 2022 also saw the welcome publication of additional research by the Department of Justice and the Probation Service, as well as several public consultations to inform policy development. However, while we have rated this standard as progress, action on previous policy commitments has been less forthcoming, so implementation will be crucial to future success under this standard. We continue to call for the full resourcing and implementation of the review of policy options for prison and penal reform. Many of the actions and recommendations detailed in this report are not new. Some of them have existed for decades. So we really need timelier and more committed implementation of actions and commitments if we don't want to find ourselves standing here again in another decade. Despite sweeping policy commitments focusing on the sparing use of imprisonment, it was disappointing to see an increase in the prison population during 2022, with this rising further into 2023, as I'm sure many of you have seen reported in the media in recent months. So IPRT will continue to closely follow the implementation of these commitments and recommendations into the coming years. Moving on to one of the standards where we've seen regress, I'm going to briefly look at solitary confinement. Most of you will be familiar with the practice, but when we talk about solitary confinement, we refer to people being isolated in their cells for 22 or more hours per day. This includes people who are confined for 24 hours a day. Published Irish Prison Service data for October 2022, which is the latest data available for the 2022 calendar year, showed that approximately 1 in 11 people who were in prison on the day that census was conducted were in solitary confinement. While this is broadly in line with the same point the previous year, a much higher proportion of people were in solitary confinement for reasons not relating to COVID-19. Rates of solitary confinement during 2022 were still significantly higher than before the pandemic, and in some instances they were actually higher than during pandemic peaks. So this is a cause for concern. While this snapshot data has enabled IPRT and other NGOs and academics and media to explore the use of solitary confinement, it represents only 1 day per quarter. We still have no oversight of the total number of people who are subjected to solitary confinement over any given period, and we also have no idea how long people are being held in solitary confinement. This has been a cause for particular concern for IPRT since the commencement of the PIPS project and long before. Given the harm that can be caused to someone's mental health and physical health due to prolonged periods of isolation, we continue to call for the Irish Prison Service to collect and publish data on the lengths of time people are being held in solitary confinement. We need this data in order to properly scrutinise the use of solitary confinement and, if needed, work together to develop targeted solutions to minimise the use of the practice. One welcome development under this standard is that in 2022 the Irish Prison Service has started including a more detailed breakdown of the rule or reason for people's confinement in the snapshot data. This is really welcome and it will allow for more thorough analysis in the years ahead, and we hope that this marks the start of even more enhanced data collection under this area. Before wrapping up this standard, while PIPS focuses on the 2022 calendar year, I want to acknowledge that based on snapshot data from earlier this year, the use of solitary confinement has reduced so far in 2023, We cautiously welcome this, but we do only have one data point to work off, so we'll hopefully see a consistent pattern of this into the months ahead. So moving on to where we have seen no change, I'm going to briefly look at our spotlight standard, women in the penal system. As mentioned earlier, the standard was informed by women who have experience of the penal system, and the topic is covered in much greater detail in the full report, so I'd encourage you to particularly read that section. While there have been some developments to improve the experience of women during 2022, ultimately we found that there was no significant change towards achieving the vision of PIPS under this standard. Female committal rates continue to be much lower than only a short number of years ago, which is positive, but there is a persistently high number of women in prison on a daily basis. Because of this, the challenges of overcrowding were felt particularly harshly by women in the penal system. With 3 exceptions, the prison with the highest occupancy rate at the beginning of each month during 2022 was Limerick Female Prison. At the end of 2022, the average occupancy rate across all prisons in the prison estate was 99% of the Irish Prison Service bed capacity, but for women's prisons this stood at 112% in the Docus Centre and 154% in Limerick Female Prison. Despite women making up approximately 4.5% of the average number of people in custody in December 2022, women made up 13% of all instances of mattress use during that month. There were 320 instances of women sleeping on mattresses on floors in December 2022. While PIPS is focused on 2022, and I'm sure you're sick of hearing me say 2022, we know from published data that the overcrowding has continued further into 2023 as we await the opening of the redeveloped Limerick Female Prison. There are many upcoming reviews and developments where there is an opportunity for stakeholders to double down on previous commitments that they've made to women. For example, we have the review of the Community Service, or the Criminal Justice Community Service Amendment Act, the review of the Fines Payment and Recovery Act, and the revision of the Prison Rules 2007. It is really important that changes are not just made equally, but that they're made equitably. Issues that persisted during 2022 under this standard include the lack of open facilities for women and particular challenges with maintaining and regaining family contact. Further to this, the non-publication of 3 reports completed by the Office of the Inspector of Prisons relating to the Docus Centre is of significant concern to IPRT. The lack of transparency here undermines any positive work that is being done in the area. Unlike the other PIPS standards where we've highlighted 1 to 2 key actions, we've set out 7 key actions under this spotlight standard. In particular, we're calling for the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Justice to carry out a specific examination on women in the penal system. If we are to make progress, we need a dedicated look at this issue beyond any one agency. An examination could explore progress to date in addressing female offending, seek to find ways to reduce the number of women in custody, and could directly engage with women who have experience of imprisonment on their views. Quite often, looking from year to year, it can be quite difficult to see progress in the penal system because some things take a long time to change. But there are many areas that can't be quantified in numbers, but when you do look back at some of the available data from when the PIPS project commenced until now, you can see a huge reduction in slopping out, a halving of the total number of committals to prison, a drop in the proportion of female committals, and an increase in resourcing of oversight. However, while these successes should be acknowledged, they don't detract from the harsh realities that continue to be experienced by many people in prison. Several concerns remain for IPRT, all of which are focused on in greater detail in the report, but chiefly among them we're concerned by the proportion of people who are sentenced committals on short sentences, the significant delays in rolling out the new complaint system, significant waiting list for access to rehabilitative services, including addiction services and psychology services, and the increase in the proportion of people toileting in the presence of another person. Further, the absence of regulations necessary to extend eligibility for parole to those serving long-term sentences is another cause for concern. So, to conclude, Ireland's penal system, discrete areas of progress aside, continues to fall short of what PIPS strives for it to be. The 3 standards and their associated actions that I've highlighted today are examples of what we need across the criminal justice system. Implementation of previous commitments, stronger data collection and publication, and improvements targeted at particular cohorts who are at risk of discrimination. We hope the key actions that we've identified in PIPS 2022 will be considered by all of the stakeholders for progression during this year and next. Despite the slow pace of change in some areas, IPRT still believes that having a world-class penal system, as was referred to earlier today, is not beyond the realm of possibility. That concludes my presentation. I wish I had more time to go through all of the standards, but I strongly encourage you to engage with the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela, for what is a very difficult task to try and briefly introduce some of the key points from PIPS. But I think in particular, Pamela told me just before we started that this was her first time presenting to a group, so I think that gives added impetus to what you're doing this morning. So we're now going to have a panel discussion where we have a number of invited guests to share their thoughts on PIPS, the penal system and the wider criminal justice system. So I'd like to invite all the members of the panel to come up and join me here, and then we'll get started. Okay, so for this part of our lunch, what we're going to have is a discussion where each participant has been asked to prepare to speak for 6 to 7 minutes. I know some are keen to maybe address standing up, some are keen to address sitting down, so it's a personal preference for each individual. And then we will have some time afterwards for a Q&A and a discussion from the floor. To start off, our first panel speaker is Caron McCaffrey. Caron is Director General of the Irish Prison Service. Prior to this, Caron worked in the Department of Justice, Equality and Law Reform before transferring to the Irish Prison Service in 2006. Caron was promoted to Director of Corporate Services in 2008 and had responsibility for several portfolios in the intervening period. Caron was appointed Director General of the Irish Prison Service in 2018, so I'd like to invite Caron to share some thoughts today.
Thanks very much, Dr. Behan, Pamela, colleagues from across the sector. I'm delighted to join with you for the launch of the 2022 Progress in the Penal System report and to have the opportunity to respond to this year's report, touching briefly on some of the issues within the report's key themes. The 2022 report is, as we've heard, the 6th edition of PIPS and reports on progress made in the penal system over the past 6 years. I, like Judge Kelly, would like to commend the IPRT on this report and the ongoing PIPS project, which represents a fair and balanced report on the progress, or regrettably regress, made in 2022 under the 28 standards. I'm joined on this panel by my colleague, Deputy Secretary General in the Department of Justice, who has responsibility for criminal justice, and I know John will speak about progress made in terms of penal reform and tackling systemic issues within our prisons through cross-departmental working and cooperation. So I'm going to focus on efforts at an organisational level to ensure we have a culture of progress, a culture of best practice, and one which does uphold human rights. And this goes to the very heart of the Progress in the Penal System framework for penal reform. As this year's PIPS report highlights, the Irish Prison Service is facing many challenges. Rising numbers in our custody, an increase in the number of people being held on remand, including women, significant mental health and addiction needs within the prison population, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining services during times of increasing demands and activities against the backdrop of a tightening labour market. That said, 2022 proved to be a transformational year for the prison service as we emerged from the pandemic. Building our systems and procedures for managing outbreaks, a highly successful and effective vaccination programme for prisoners did allow the organisation to take steps at an early stage in 2022 to reintroduce prisoner services and programmes during the course of the year. In the context of rising numbers of prisoners in our custody, it is of significant importance the Irish Prison Service brought some important infrastructural projects to completion in 2022. The Limerick Prison Build project was fully completed in 2022 and the new B-Wing is fully operational. Significant workforce planning is also underway to enable the opening of the new standalone female wing during the summer. And it's such a cause of regret and personal disappointment to me that we haven't yet been in a position to open that accommodation, because I'm acutely aware of the conditions that we're holding women in Limerick. It isn't for the want of a desire or an ambition on our side. We have got significant staffing issues, unfortunately, but we're working really hard to get that accommodation up and running as quickly as you can, because it will certainly transform the context within which services are provided to women in our custody. Another very important project in 2022 was the reopening of the training unit as a repurposed location for older male prisoners, and that's now fully operational and occupied. Our 2019 to 2022 strategic plan has come to an end, and much has been delivered in terms of our ambition and our vision for a safer community through excellence in a prison service built on respect for human dignity, including significantly strengthening governance and accountability, improving prisoner services in the prisoner journey, and enhancing the safety and security of our prisons. Some of this progress is reflected in the standard assessed as having achieved progress in today's report. We are now finalising our new strategic plan, and it comes at a critical time. On the 1st of July 2022, Minister McEntee announced government approval to establish the Irish Prison Service as a full statutory agency of the Department of Justice. The establishment of the organisation as a statutory agency acknowledges the critical role the Irish Prison Service plays in the criminal justice sector. As the service prepares to go forward on a statutory footing as a scheduled office under a government-appointed board, we are continuing to strengthen internal controls and governance arrangements to support corporate capacity and maintain and ensure consistency, transparency and accountability for the services we provide on behalf of the state. With that in mind, the next iteration of our strategic plan will focus on a number of themes to support our aims to consolidate and increase the service capacity to people in our custody, to make our services more accessible, and to continue collaboration with our stakeholders and partners to progress penal and public service reform. A key driver in many of our successful initiatives and modernisation programmes, particularly during the pandemic, was the harnessing of technology. In February 2022, the Irish Government launched a new national digital strategy, Harnessing Digital, the Digital Island Framework, to drive and enable economic and societal change. Our work in this area is also aligned to the criminal justice sectoral strategy, and particularly Pillar 3, Data as a Driver. Digitalisation will form a key pillar of our new strategic plan. Digitalisation of our services, from committal procedures to release, will enable transparent, tailored services, prioritising both efficiency and effectiveness in a cohesive and holistic manner. Digital is also a must for innovating educational programmes, policies and practices, and increased digital literacy will support prisoner outcomes, which of course leads to reductions in recidivism and improves public safety. Emerging innovative technologies provide the opportunity to shape the narrative for modernisation of the prison estate and its services. The service will continue to build on its development of an operational reporting and analysis capability to support being a data-driven service. Improved capability of our data analytics will facilitate improving management information in relation to trend analysis and the identification and management of risk across the service. This will also support the broader policy objectives of the criminal justice sector through the provision of quality data and metrics, which will inform and support policy decision making. I do know, Pamela, that a number of the PIPS standards could not be reported on for 2022 due to limits on the availability of information and data, and our work in this area will aim to support the full assessment of all standards set out in the framework. To ensure we have sufficient capacity to meet our obligations in terms of safe and secure custody and dignity of care, a core focus of our new strategic plan will be on capacity, with the aim of identifying short, medium and long-term capacity and policy opportunities to deal with increasing prisoner numbers. The 2022 PIPS report states, and I quote, "The importance of prison culture cannot be overstated." I am deeply proud of the respectful and positive relationships that exist between our staff and people in our care, and the organisation's ethos that our prisons are places of opportunity and hope and not places of punishment. Ensuring that everybody committed to our custody is encouraged to take the opportunity to reach their full potential is at the heart of our mission and will continue to be so. The culture of an organisation can be the strongest driver for positive change or the strongest inhibitor against it. The Irish Prison Service is facing a significant change agenda through its endeavours to modernise the estate and services, and as it prepares to be constituted and operate on a statutory basis. Our greatest asset in achieving under this change programme is our staff. Prisons are a unique environment, and continuing to embed a positive organisation culture will positively reinforce our efforts to renew the organisation at this pivotal time. As part of the implementation of our new strategic plan, the Irish Prison Service has planned a culture audit for later this year, which will have an important role in highlighting any cultural issues in the organisation and in providing a basis to proactively address any issues which may emerge. Finally, and as mentioned in the PIPS 2022 forward, the Irish Prison Service commenced a review of the prison rules in 2020 following the publication of the revised European prison rules by the Council of Europe. While delayed due to the pandemic, work was started in earnest in 2022, and significant progress in the development of a working document has been achieved. These amended rules will take full account of the European Rules 2020 and, in my view, represent a significant opportunity for making real and tangible positive progress in our penal system. Thank you.
Thank you, Caron. Our next speaker is Mark Wilson, who is Director of the Probation Service. Mark is a qualified social worker who previously held positions in the Irish Prison Service and the Probation Service. And during his earlier periods in the Probation Service, Mark contributed to setting up of the Sex Offender Risk Assessment and Management and the Joint Agency Response to Crime programmes. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Cormac, and thank you to IPRT for the invitation to speak today, and congratulations on your report. President Kelly, thank you also for your endorsement of the service, the unsung hero, so re-emphasise that in case anyone missed it in the audience. Before I start, I do want to take the time just to acknowledge the work of Caron and her team during COVID and post-COVID, coming into the pressure that she's currently under. The dedication and advocacy for prisoners is relentless, and I just want to take the chance to say that today. By way of context for the Probation Service, I think hopefully the audience here knows us, 430 staff, 35 offices at presence in every prison. In 2021, we worked with about 15,000 people in the community. We prepared over 10,000 pre-sanction reports to assist the President and his colleagues with sentencing decisions. But we also worked with about 2,800 prisoners. There's a growing trend in court orders where more prisoners are being placed on post-custody orders. And that now amounts to about 1,800 prisoners who are today under supervision post-custody on a court order. So our interest in the work of the Penal Reform Trust and looking at this area starts at the point of the pre-sanction report through to those who are working with us on community service as a direct alternative to imprisonment, through to work in custody and post-custody. So we really are very present in this space. I have told Cormac to hit me by the arm here when time's up, because again, the President was just remarking before, and we could talk about this all day, so I'm conscious of that. So there's two things, there's two kind of presenting issues really. The one is the short-term immediate pressure that Caron and her colleagues are on, and how that's indicated in the report in terms of overcrowding, solitary confinement, all of those issues. And unfortunately on our side, like Caron, we're experiencing a high level of difficulty getting staff in, and that is frustrating our ability to offer as much support to Caron as we would like to do. That hopefully will break the back of that problem later in the summer. So what I am going to focus on the medium to longer term responses and how we have restructured recently to enable us to deal with the issues that the PIPS report is highlighting. So operations within the Probation Service used to be one deputy director. We've now split that in two. We have a director for courts and community, and we have given a separate director for the prisoner and reintegration area to increase our ability to consider the issues, to work in partnership with the prison service, and to develop and expand the range of sanctions that are available to the courts and the community side. We did headhunt IPRT's Fiona Nicaneda, who was down back there. And then we gave Fiona the very issues that she'd been criticising us for as her job to now implement, and Fi's doing a great bit of work on that. But that directorate obviously has a lead for our services to prisoners, who oversees the work of the staff in the prisons. But we've strengthened that by putting in a new post at AP level for social inclusion and integration. And the term intersectionality was raised yesterday, which I thought was a great term. But what we're trying to do is to pull together our responses to separate social inclusion issues and bring them into a single focus, so that we can have better systemic responses to the obstacles that were being experienced by those that we're working with. So that development is an important one. It'll also give us the opportunity to further strengthen our alignment with activity with the prison service, and that will come to fruition later this year. The person is in post. Another post that we have put in place is one to lead on community sanctions, and in particular community service. We have reviewed community service in terms of its kind of policy and strategy. We're just completing a review of it operationally, and we will have an implementation plan prepared shortly, which is aiming to increase judicial confidence in the sanction, its efficiency, but also how we can, what we want to do with it is it's working beyond the completion of hours and moving into the reintegration element of it, which we can strengthen through partnerships. And we have some interesting partnerships that are nearly tied down, which we'll be able to talk about at a later stage. But it really will help us change gear with community service, and that will have stated metrics and deliverables attached to it. But that post is also designed to focus on the implementation of the review of penal policy, and we'll work closely with criminal justice policy and with the prison service to ensure that we can really focus on those actions to achieve meaningful outcomes as are required. The last post within that, or section within that team that Fee leads on, is the Restorative Justice and Victims Unit. And the President has asked us to look at our pre-sanction reports and how we can best include consideration of that more consistently within pre-sanction reports. But we are also conscious of getting greater clarity, if you like, on the product that we're offering to the court in respect of how restorative matters will be dealt with, and the complementarity of the work between the probation officer intervention and the funded project intervention. And again, the President referenced some of those today. We are putting our resource into the Northwest to complement that what we call our funded project capability to support greater use of restorative justice. In terms of, we have also set up an effective practice directorate, and this touches on the issues around services to women, services to members of the travelling community, but also ensuring that we are promoting and evidencing the research and data that we need to be able to inspire the confidence that results in greater use of community sanctions, but also that it is that we are getting the relevant data that drives effectively the direction of travel that we're going on, that we're not simply it's setting hard targets essentially so that we can report on the progress we're making. Sure. 2 points I'll make. On the communication side, again, promoting probation and what probation is, we have put a communications team in place, and we have 2 of the team here today. That's proving very successful, so we're very keen on that. And I just want to speak a little bit on women in terms of our work there. So we have a working with women specific group in the service. That will be expanded this year to bring in our funded projects, but also the user voice, so that will be strengthened. But we also have 2 residential units, 2 Sanua and Finglas and Outlook. Both will have reviews done this year. We're also funding a new project in Donegal, working with women. We're extending the BRIO project that we funded in Dublin to Munster, so that will also be done. And lastly, I just mentioned that the risk assessment instrument that we use as the general tool for our assessment for pre-sanction reports, we're updating that. The analogy is the iPhone 6 to the iPhone 11. The new tool is more responsive to the needs of gender and ethnicity, so we're confident that we're moving in the right direction in respect of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Next we have Paul Grace, who is an experienced team leader at the Solas project. Paul is involved in building long-term relationships with young people at risk of being marginalised by society, specifically through education, employment and the justice systems. Paul is experienced working in addiction and outreach services. We're pleased to hear from Paul today, who can bring his own experience and expertise working with community, statutory and private sectors to this conversation.
The plan was to sit and listen to the first couple of speakers and then kind of tailor what I was going to say based on what they said, but my brain decided to kick in and I'd rather be anxious than prepared, so apologies, I don't know what's going to come out here today. I suppose looking at the kind of the overview of this report, and I've been talking to a couple of people over the last couple of days, and because I was really unsure about what I was going to get up here and speak about, or how I was going to kind of present myself, because this is not something I'd normally do, and I suppose looking back and my experience of the criminal justice system and the prison system, and I know Judge Kelly touched on, you know, how sentencing is he likes that sentencing is the last resort. I suppose for me, I was locked up on my first offence, on my first conviction. I was sent to St Michael's Institution in Finglas for assessment, and you know, and I suppose when I got there, like, what kind of stood out was that I was, you know, my community was heavily represented in places like that, and as I progressed through the different institutions like Patrick's and Mountjoy and Wheatfield and stuff like that, it's like, you know, the communities that I came from and other communities like it were heavily represented, and you know, I suppose you know, when I think back on it now, I can reflect on it, and there's some sort of separation for me in that. But at the time, like you know, those conditions became very normal to me very quickly, and I learned how to adapt and survive in it. But with separation, I can see it differently. Like, you know, we survived by being heightened and alert constantly, and you know, and I suppose living in a state of preparedness for anything, and not understanding like the effects that type of stress has on the body, on the mind, and even in a situation like this, how anxious I am now is as a result of learning how to survive in environments like that. And you know, looking at some of the things from the report, and looking at you know, the conditions, and remembering some of the conditions that we lived in, and you know, so that I know that there's an increase in overcrowding now in the prison system, and my experience of that, you know, there were times where there'd be 8 to 10 of us sleeping on the floor of a holding cell on mattresses, and you know, or being in the basin Mountjoy with 3 or 4 to like a single cell, or you know, I was talking to someone the other day about there was a cell on A1 in Mountjoy called the Caron, and it had 3 sets of bunk beds in it, and then you'd probably have 2 or 3 people as well who were sleeping on the floor, and at that time there was no toilet facilities, or so we shared a pot that we used as a toilet, you know, but there was there was a sense for me, and again, like, I wouldn't have had the kind of the self-awareness to recognise this at the time, but there was a sense of being dehumanised and degraded, and you know, I remember when I was in St. Patrick's, I was 16 years of age. I was already on methadone at the time. A lot of my offending would have been linked to substance use, and I remember there was this particular prison officer. He was a medic, and when he called us for methadone, he'd come out to the yard, and he'd shout things like, "Anyone for soup?" You know, and when you went down and got it, it was like, "Get your foy and say goodbye." You know, he had these little kind of witty things that he found hilarious, and you know, but it was, at the time, it was things that I recognise now, chipped away at my self-worth, you know, chipped away at, you know, how I viewed myself, and you know, chipped away at, you know, that kind of, it was an environment of distrust. You know, it was an environment of disconnection, on both sides. So, you know, and that kind of that was a common theme throughout. And I was listening to a podcast a while back, and it was the former Governor John Lanigan on it, and he was talking about this type of stuff, and he was talking about you know, how he tried to treat people with dignity and respect, and you know, the positive interactions that I had with prison officers in prison were based on the fact that they treated me with dignity and respect, because my experience was that's, you know, when I'm met with judgment, when I'm met with exclusion, when I'm met with that kind of, you know, distrust, and that's how I respond. That's what I'll give back. And the most positive interactions, or the most positive kind of relationships that I had, there was still that element of us in them. There was always that was there as a culture, but there was, you know, the most positive ones where, you know, where I'd go to the school and the teachers would actually treat you like a person, and you know, or prison officers. There was a time when I was on remand, and I was in Wheatfield prison, and I was in for something I didn't do that time. And I'd said that throughout, like I said, I didn't do this, like, and I was on remand for quite a while, and the majority of prison officers would be like, you know, many people in here that were innocent, and you know. But there was one prison officer that never actually questioned me. I don't know whether he believed me or not, but he never actually questioned me. And I came back from the court on the day that the case was dropped, and that prison officer came over to me and he shook my hand, and he was so happy for me, and you know, and it was like, I was kind of taken back by that, and I didn't know what to do with that. Yeah. You know, because the relationship with prison officers and the prison service, and you know, that was look, very unusual for me, you know, was looking at kind of this. So again, I touched on the fact that like, my community and my circumstances were heavily represented in the prison system, and like, coming from a marginalised community, and you know, social deprivation, and you know, look, Garda in my community knew my age from 5 or 6 years old, and it wasn't because I was getting into trouble at 5 or 6 years old. They were very open about telling us that, like, you're gonna end up committing crimes, you're gonna end up in prison. This is, and you know, as a 5 or 6 year old, like, I internalised that, and that became a belief about myself, that this is where my life was gonna go, this is where I was gonna end up, and then it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, because I've been conditioned to believe certain things, and you know, so when we went to prison, I see that now as they were opportunities for intervention. They were opportunities for certain things to be done, certain things to be addressed. And I don't want to come across like, I don't want to sit up here and come across like I didn't deserve to go to prison, like I shouldn't have been locked up, because that's not the case. There's absolutely things that I did that I needed to go to prison for, you know. But so in there was like, we're looking at words like reintegration. I know we said, look, they were understanding of taking the photographs, that this is like, it's a great page to be open on, but there was little to no reintegration. A lot of the symptoms of the symptoms of what I struggled with in life were addressed. Like, they detoxed me in a prison, or they locked me up for committing a crime, which was fair, like, a lot of the time. But it was when I was released back into the same environment, I was released back into the same community, I was released back into the same conditions, sometimes worse. Sometimes I'd have housing before I went in, and I'd be released homeless and in emergency accommodation, and you know, and my perception of the environment wasn't addressed, or you know, I'm running over, am I?
I'm getting instructions from here.
I thought I wouldn't make it this but I suppose the conditions, or my understanding of the conditions, or ways to navigate it, weren't addressed, and I didn't know how to do that on my own. And I suppose where change went for me, and I was talking to a friend of mine last night, and he was saying about probation, and how a probation officer was the one that really had them. And I was like, nah, probation didn't really do that for me. But I remember when I first got clean, or whatever you want to call that, came into recovery, when that first happened for me, I still had charges, and I was sent back. There was a probation report ordered. And I was just talking to him last night that I remembered that probation officer was probably the first person in that position that treated me with respect and trust and belief, and you know, I'd none of those things for myself. So to have somebody that treated me like that, and it was like, I didn't really make the connection till last night, you know. But that for me, that was where the turning points happened, when I found people who believed in me, who trusted me, who had hope for me, all the things that I was lacking in myself, and they showed that, and they kind of, you know, opened doors for me, because like, where I came from, I know of one person who went to college. There could have been more, but I know of one person, and she got a scholarship and went to the States to play basketball, you know. So it was like, you know, this stuff was abnormal to me, that people from my community would go to college, be educated, you know, and I suppose even in terms of basic life skills and managing stress and you know, emotional regulation and all that kind of things that were alien to me, and that one way of managing situations like that, and that was to use drugs to lessen the impact of that stuff on me, and then my use of drugs landed me in prison, or you know, in really difficult situations. So yeah, I'll leave the rest up to people asking questions. Thanks.
So he's got the fan club
Have
now.
fans now. Signing autographs later.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Next to speak, we have John O'Callaghan, who's Deputy General Secretary for the Criminal Justice Pillar in the Department of Justice. Before his current position, John held several roles within the Department of Justice, including Head of Civil Legislation and Policy and the Head of Policing. John.
I'm going to go up if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
Well, no, is it the afternoon? It's not yet. Good morning, everyone. And thanks, Cormac, Judge Kelly, ladies and gentlemen. Just want to start by thanking the IPRT for the invitation here today. People won't believe this from the Department of Justice, but we actually value oversight. We value people looking in and seeing what we're doing. The work obviously of Mark and the Inspector of Prisons, the CPT, and the work of the IPRT is very important to us. The justice system is obviously a complex system, lots of moving parts, lots of things that influence it that we've no input to, little or no control over, and to some extent it's at the end of a system that then started, in Paul's case, at a very young age, and with people almost predicting where people would end up. And I suppose what struck me as Paul was finishing there is how many more kids are out there just today in the exact same position, and I suppose that's perhaps something we all need to think about. There's much that's in this report that has been incorporated into the policy work undertaken by the Department of Justice over the last 2 years, and we're now moving forward the implementation of that work. And I can assure Pamela that there is an implementation group that's been established shortly that has one job in life, and that's to see this report implemented. So we'll be keeping a very close eye on that. The publication of the report last August makes clear our commitment that prisons should be one of a range of options available to deal with crime. And I do take Judge Kelly's word for it, and I believe it to be the case, that it is an option of last resort in the vast majority of cases. I don't believe, and I think the numbers bear it out, I think if we did have trigger-happy judges who were sending people to prison at the first opportunity, we would have a lot more people in prison than we do in Ireland. So I think, but that's not to say that we do need to reinforce that message. That is our position, that's the policy position. Alternatives to prison are our preferred option. Core to the review is the principle that while punishment for those who commit crime is a central element of our justice system, rehabilitation is at the core of our penal system. Interventions and services to promote better social behaviour, to focus on rehabilitation and provide the supports to end reoffending are what's necessary to drive and sustain real change and to make communities safer for everyone. The review also looks at how to address issues specifically affecting women. I know that's a particular focus of the report. It suggests that we continue to seek to develop and expand the range of community-based sanctions, including alternatives to imprisonment, and that the following items be explored and pursued. If efficacy and value of a bail supervision system for female, young adults and other marginalised persons, the feasibility of providing a structured rehabilitative response for women, the introduction of weekend non-custodial sentences, and that we build on the joint prison probation service strategy and effective response to females who offend, and incorporate the recently developed towards a best practice approach to working with women who offend. If we are to succeed in reducing offending patterns, we have to look beyond the criminal justice system, as I said earlier, to things like health, education and employment. We know that a significant number of people who end up before the courts have addiction issues. We know the relationship between substance abuse and offending behaviour, and we know that addressing addiction issues is key to breaking the cycle. We also know that a significant number of people committed to prison have mental health issues. From this perspective, the implementation of the recommendations made by the high-level task force, which considered the mental health and addiction challenges of those who come into contact with the criminal justice system, will be instrumental in creating systems and care paths that focus on the root causes of people's behaviour. The task force established 3 subgroups composed of experts from various disciplines and was chaired by high-ranking officials from the criminal justice system, but importantly with health leads represented and contributing. This was vitally important to this work, as the recommendations made by the task force require an all-of-system approach beyond the criminal justice system and into healthcare services and community supports. When implemented, these recommendations will divert people away from the criminal justice system where appropriate, while supporting them in their rehabilitation from addiction and in the recovery and management of their illness. They will build on existing best practice to ensure adequate provision of services and sufficient safeguards to support rehabilitation and true care from custody to the community. Implementation of both of these important policies is a priority for the Department of Justice, and we will continue to work with our colleagues from the Department of Health and other colleagues to introduce the changes needed. For completeness, I mentioned a piece of work complementary to that of the task force, the report of the first ever health needs assessment for the Irish Prison Service, which was recently published by the Ministers for Justice and Health. This independent review of the current and future delivery of appropriate provision of healthcare services to people in custody sets out a number of recommendations for the optimal development of healthcare services in the prison service. I mentioned these 3 comprehensive and complementary pieces of work to show that we are focused on the individual health needs of those who come into contact with the criminal justice system. We know the importance of ensuring that adequate healthcare services are accessible to all individuals, preferably intervening before a custodial sentence is imposed. Within the custodial setting, we want to develop formal pathways between the prison service and the wider health system, and are working with the Department of Health and the HSE to achieve this. By addressing the physical and mental health needs of people who engage with the criminal justice system, and by prioritising rehabilitation, we are not only investing in the future of individuals, but also fostering a safer and more inclusive society for everyone. But there is no avoiding the fact that our prisons are facing serious capacity issues at the moment. Having visited a number of prisons recently, I have seen firsthand the negative impacts of overcrowding on both staff and on those in custody. And again, Paul mentioned this, particularly in his own experience, and I think it bears out what I saw in prisons recently. Measures were recently approved to reduce capacity pressures, including by broadening and amending the eligibility for certain schemes, and that's effectively people being released early from prison to free up places. But these on their own are not sufficient to deal with the situation. Some in the room will remember the so-called revolving door in the prison system, which created in the public consciousness the image of a system in meltdown. Confidence in the criminal justice system is essential to our vision of a safe, fair and inclusive Ireland. It is in no one's interest that the system would be undermined by a perception, or worse still, the reality that orders of the court had little or no effect. It is our job to ensure that there is accommodation for those committed to prison. And I'll go further. The accommodation should be of a standard that we are proud of, and the services provided to those imprisoned, whether in terms of healthcare, education or training, should be of the highest standard. Achieving this is made almost impossible if our prisons are at full or more capacity. Worse still, the prisons themselves can become dangerous for staff and prisoners alike. Regimes become stricter, and our capacity to use imprisonment for rehabilitation are undermined. The reality is that we have to provide the prison spaces that we can reasonably forecast are required, while at the same time doing all of the things that are set out in our prison and penal policy review. The Department is and will remain committed to progressing the comprehensive policies that I've outlined, which are aimed at diverting people away from the criminal justice system where possible, and at better supporting those who are given a custodial sentence by the court. I can assure you that we will continue to work with colleagues across government and with stakeholders to help bring us towards a system that is built on rehabilitation, on supporting individuals to address the underlying cause of offending, on reducing recidivism rates, and on ensuring that everyone's human rights are protected. And finally, once again, thanks to the IPRT for their work in this area of many years. You continue to make a really valuable contribution to those of us charged with charting policy in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So next we have Mark Kelly, who's the Chief Inspector of Prisons. Mark is an international human rights lawyer who has extensive international and national experience in the areas of monitoring prisons, police custody and administrative detention. Most recently, and prior to his appointment as Chief Inspector of Prisons last year, Mark served as the Vice President of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, CPT. Mark.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much to the IPRT for the possibility to be here, and also to the Human Rights and Equality Commission for making this space available. The PIPS report is a very significant contribution to discussions about reform in the penal system in Ireland. But this year's report is important not only on its own merits, but also because this is something that the IPRT has now been doing for a number of years. And Mark Wilson spoke about the fact that he's been successful in poaching FITE to come and work with his service. And we've been very fortunate in the inspectorate that we succeeded in poaching Inspector Michelle Martins, who's with us this morning, who is a former lead author of the PIPS report for the IPRT. So you can be assured that we will pay the closest possible attention to this report in our office and in our inspectorate. But PIPS, I think, properly understood, and it's there in the subtitle of the report, is a framework for penal reform, a little like the framework for the inspection of prisons that we use in the inspectorate. And I think what's important about that, and I was very struck by that when Pamela was speaking about it, is all of this data and all of these individual indications have their importance and their significance, but you need to have the capacity then to take a holistic view of what they mean and to interpret them. So I just wanted very briefly to talk about three major issues that are preoccupying us in the Inspectorate at the moment. And building really on what Paul Grace was saying, to say a little bit more about what those issues actually look and feel like in practice when you're in Irish prisons at the moment. And the three issues are overcrowding, the mental health of prisoners, and access to education and training. On overcrowding, one can put a figure on the screen, 145% overcrowded or whatever it might be. And it's easy to understand that the prisons, the system as a whole is over capacity at the moment. But there are at least three locations within the Irish prison system at the moment where the conditions in which people are being held raise issues under Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. One of them, the Director General has already alluded to, which is the situation of women in Limerick prison. And it's encouraging to think that the very impressive new facility for women in Limerick may be open rather soon over the summer. I certainly hope that will be the case. But there are other locations where there isn't a brand new, very impressive building sitting there, which, when staffed, can alleviate the problem. We've just finished with my colleague Dr. Ciara O'Connell, who's also here this morning, an inspection of Clover Hill Prison. And the conditions for men in Clover Hill Prison, 4 men in a 3-man cell with one unpartitioned lavatory, certainly also fall into the sphere of concern where Article 3 is concerned. Mental health. Director General, you have spoken about this in great detail at the Prison Officers Association conference recently. And as we sit here this morning, there are people in a number of prisons in the state who have acute psychosis, open psychosis, who are in a state of great distress and who simply cannot be kept and cared for appropriately in a prison environment. They need to be in a hospital. They need to be most probably in the central mental hospital. So when John talks about pathways, absolutely, but some of these pathways are simply not open. The central mental hospital has moved from Dundrum to Portratton, but the extent to which it is taking people in great distress from the prisons has not increased with any great significance. And this is not something that can be laid at the door of the prison system. Access to education and training. There are some fantastic things happening in the prisons where this is concerned. Amazing catering courses in Cormac prison. I'm quite sure a number of people are watching Gaelic in the Joy at the moment. Access to sport, team building, etc. And these are tremendous things, but the reality is still that they're available to a very limited number of people. Clover Hill again, fantastic efforts to keep the school open. The school is virtually never closed in Clover Hill Prison, unlike in certain other prisons, but only about 10% of prisoners at any one time actually have access to it. So these are amongst some of the three big issues that we're focusing on in the Inspectorate, and of course also the situation more generally of women in prison, which the PIPS report covers so well. They're real and they're pressing, and they require not just a whole criminal justice system response, but, and I know that the Department of Justice is acutely aware of this, an interdepartmental response, especially in relation to the involvement of the Department of Health and the HSE. Then, just about 2 quick comments. I thought this audience might appreciate a quick word on what we have been up to recently in the Inspectorate and a look at the future. Since October, November last year, we have activated a programme of full unannounced inspections of prisons in Ireland. These are inspections that take place under our framework for inspection, which looks at respect and dignity, safety and security, health and well-being, rehabilitation and development, and also resettlement, so a crossover with probation-related issues. And so far we've done 3 of those inspections in Mountjoy just before Christmas, in Cork in the early part of this year, and just yesterday we finished another full unannounced inspection in Clover Hill. And the fact that we've done 3 of them in quite a short space of time, I'm hoping will also give us the capacity as we finalise the reports to look across the system and look for issues that are transversal and make recommendations that are not just to the individual prison, but also to you, Director General, and to the Minister, where that's appropriate. And in addition to that, we've completed a thematic inspection of the provision of mental health in Irish prisons in 7 of the 12 prisons in the state, with the expert assistance of a consultant psychiatric specialist and a psychiatric nurse. And that report is very near to completion, and I hope will be a useful contribution to an ongoing debate in that area. As for the future, people may know that there is draft legislation at the moment, the general scheme of the Inspection of Places of Detention Bill, which is currently scheduled for priority drafting to become a real bill. And the purpose of that legislation is to expand the mandate of the Inspectorate of Prisons. It will become the Inspectorate of Places of Detention, which will mean that for the first time ever in Ireland, there will be independent inspection of detention by An Garda Síochána. But not only that, because the legislation proposes that detention by An Garda Síochána, but also prisoner and detainee transport and court holding cells will fall within the mandate of the Inspectorate as well as prisons. So what that means, the concept from our standpoint, is that a person's entire detention journey, from the moment that they're first apprehended in the street by An Garda Síochána, placed in a Garda car, driven to a Garda station, perhaps appear in court, all the way through to a potential remand in custody and or sentence, that entire journey will fall under the inspection mandate of the Inspector of Prisons, which will be really helpful, I think. Again, I come back to Clover Hill because it's the place we've been most recently, because there's this constant turnover of people through the courts into court holding cells. And it's going to enable us to look at critical issues such as what sort of proportion of people who are currently in prison really need to be there. Is there a cohort of people on no cash bail, people on €100 bail, who would be much better dealt with through the kinds of initiatives that Judge Kelly has been talking about? Could restorative justice take the place of imprisonment? Final thing I wanted to say is to IPRT, thank you very much again for the fact that what you describe as the increased outputs of the Inspectorate of Prisons is one of just 4 areas that you've highlighted as being areas of progress. That's very nice, but I think we have to ask ourselves, what is an output? I'm satisfied that we have ramped up our programme of inspections and will continue to do that. But really, I think our work becomes a real output, firstly, when it's published. And that's not something that's within our control at the moment. It will be in future. But just to give you one example, we have another excellent thematic report on education and training in Irish prisons. I sent that to the Minister on the 23rd of December last year, and it still hasn't been published. And this isn't, it's not even a terribly contentious report. The IPS has welcomed it, but it's not in the public domain. So you have to have our reports for them to be real outputs. And absolutely finally, our recommendations are only really outputs when they're implemented. And so just to echo what John was saying at the very end of his presentation there, there is very little point, in my view, in monitoring for the sake of monitoring, whether it's by PIPS or it's by the inspector. There has to be implementation of recommendations that are agreed. So, thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, Mark. I'd now like to open the proceedings to the floor. We have approximately, I think, 15 minutes for discussion. So, if anybody would like to speak, maybe if they gave their name or organisation, if they're comfortable doing that. So, who would like to start? Hi.
Hey, I'm Sandra.
We have people with roaming mics.
Sorry, I'm Sandra. I do BRIO, Building Recovery Units and Networks. So I go up to the prison. It's due reduced use. The women's prison. In the women's prison. I go up to the women's prison and we do reduce the use of BRIO, Building Recovery Units and Networks. And it's very bad in the women's prison. It really is. And there's mental health in it. They're not getting enough time with their kids on visits. They're stigmatised. They're thrown out the gate with white bags, see-through bags. So we asked, could they get bags that wasn't see-through to be brought up to them when they're coming out the gates, because I know what it's like. I've been there. And it's revolving doors all the time for the women, especially in the inner city. And it's horrible coming out them gates when you're in that situation. Now I've turned my life around since 2019, and it's still happening with their women. They're stigmatised. There's officers putting bets on them when they're going out the gate. Oh, you'll be back in next week. It's disgraceful going out that gate with see-through bags. They're not allowed to get cosmetics in. They're only getting basic and enhanced payment weekly. That's if they get enough of tobacco. Then they probably haven't got family out there, some of the women, that can't send money into them. So they have to live off other prisoners, which is not fair. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandra.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much to the IPRT. My name is Mark Ward, and the Sinn Féin TD for Dublin Midwest. So I'm also the party spokesperson for mental health, and recently being appointed junior spokesperson for justice. So I'm at being on the Joint Directors Committee for Justice. So in the last couple of weeks as well. So I'm here as a listening brief and a learning brief, and a really informative meeting. And I was struck by a number of things that people said in relation to. Just a couple of points I picked up. There's probably 3 strands I kind of picked up in relation to the prevention piece, to stop people going into prison in the first place. And I was listening to Justice Kelly when he was talking about the comments in the journal. I haven't seen them, but I can only guess. I was only speaking yesterday in the Dáil in relation to increasing the guarded diversion programmes up to the age of 25, a way of stopping people going into prison. And the Twitter pile-on I got for just trying to do some small reform. There's no votes in this, but that doesn't bother me. But I was taken with what Paul was said as well in relation to when he comes out of prison, because that's an awful lot around people from my area. I'm from a fairly similar area from Paul, area of high disadvantage. I was actually in the Joy there myself a couple of weeks ago for different reasons. The Gaelic in the Joy, I was one of the politicians that went in and played the lads in a Gaelic match there. And I knew half the lads, and I knew half the people in the Landlands that were all ordinary name down. Lads I grew up with, some family members as well, and it's just part of the life that we were brought up in. That's the road some people unfortunately ended up on, and a lot of times through no choices of their own as well. But that piece, I think that's the big piece, is when someone leaves prison and they haven't got that wraparound support, they haven't got a place to call home, they haven't got money in their pocket. So it's very difficult for somebody not to re-offend under them circumstances. So I was wondering what the panel thought about how we put things in place to stop that happening. When somebody leaves prison, that they have these supports in place, because I think that's a really, really important piece. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So, would any member of the panel like to reply?
Yeah. So I'm struck by your comments in relation to the Dukas, and thanks for the enriched work that you're doing. We have been making steps to support women better, and I know Governor Galvey is here with me, but we've taken some small steps to support women with enhanced gratuity. We have made additional items, toiletries and makeup free of charge available on a monthly basis, so we are taking small steps, but I do accept there's small steps and there's more we can and should do to support women. And I think the point you both make is really right in terms of the through the gate piece. That is absolutely essential. And I think, Paul, you mentioned it as well. You know, when you go out, that you're going out, you know, to the supports that are required. So, I mean, you know, we make sure everybody has a medical card before they're released if they're entitled to it. Everybody has a social welfare payment. But what people really need, you know, are key worker relationships within the community to provide and help people navigate. And I know Mark mentioned earlier the statistics in relation to post-release supervision orders, and just the number of people who are coming out from custody into a supportive probation environment. So I might just pass over for Mark maybe to say something about that.
Yeah, thanks for that. The reintegration piece is complex. Just as an example, we have a homeless offender team in Dublin that deals with those who are, you know, homeless. That has a caseload of about 400 at the moment. And how do you start to make changes when you're essentially not sure of your accommodation on an ongoing basis? That's kind of like the reality in which we live at the moment in terms of the housing problem. And you extend that across the mental health services, where it's not for the want of trying to put the services in place, but they simply can't get the staff in to actually deliver the services. So if you're like, in trying for us putting in place the processes that guarantee or support those transitions, we are restricted in what we can achieve by the limitations within the broader areas that John touched on earlier on. In the Task Force on Mental Health report, we in the pillar that looked at community and through care, the concept of having social inclusion managers under Sláinte care was recommended, and that would be for 50,000 of population. There would be a social inclusion manager who would straddle the justice and the health sides to be able to get greater access to primary and secondary health services. And I think that type of joined up case management, joined up communication, and you're trying to marry clinical and non-clinical interventions to better outcome really is very progressive, and I do hope we can achieve that as that plan gets implemented.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, sure.
Just on the point that Sandra made as well, that's something that we've been talking about recently as well, and something that kind of stands out to me is that leaving with that clear plastic bag. And I'll talk to Molly about it, and it's, you know, instantly it's that my mind goes to everybody knows where I'm coming from, everybody knows that I'm walking out of Mount Joy now, and they probably don't, but it's the stigma that's attached, and that kind of internal dialogue that already exists in me now is just reinforced. And just on market, so there is services that work with people pre and post release. You know, I did a piece with Care After Prison, who's represented here today, where we worked with in Wheatfield Prison, working on pre and post release programs for individuals coming out, and they have the CSS there and the you know, but there's not enough to cover everybody that's in there. And I suppose the community resources, you know, could be better utilised, and even with kind of peer mentor supports, you know. It's really difficult to get prison clearance if you've been in prison.
Yeah.
Do you know? And they're the resources that could be utilised better. Using the people who have come through the system to support the individuals who are there and addressing the underlying issues. Do you know?
I can Caron first and then come back to you.
We could just spend all time talking amongst ourselves, but like we have realised, I suppose we always knew, but we realised more during COVID that the peer support model works and works best for people. So we've got some really great programmes. Red Cross came into its own, the listener scheme, and we're developing a recovery programme that would be peer-led. And I think your point is really well made. In terms of, you know, that peer model, and then hopefully that can provide employment when somebody's released. Just on the bag issue, I mean, I absolutely take that point, and I can see my colleague Governor Conroy from Midlands Prison here, who has introduced a new type of bag, David Wright, that everybody gets when they're leaving custody, and that has been rolled out nationally. So you're absolutely right, we shouldn't be sending anybody out the gate, you know, with the stigma or been identified by people as just having been released from custody. So that is something we've taken action on, and just to thank Governor Conroy for taking the lead in relation to that.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to pick up the point that Paul made there, just to give a shout out to Care After Prison and organisations like that. I think there's another one, UCASA down in Kilkenny, I think, is it? And one or two around the country. They do very good work with very, very limited resources, and it's not the most, what's the word, popular or sexy type of thing for a charitable organisation to try and raise funds for. We're looking after people who've come out of prison. It just doesn't generate the sort of fluffy, you know, bleeding heart type of stuff that we're all used to with charities. But I do think organisations like that have a great role to play and need to be supported. And, you know, people coming out of prison very often, as Mark said, are going into homelessness. They don't know where they're going to sleep that night. You know, how do you observe your post-release conditions or your probation bond conditions if you don't know where you're going to be, if you don't know where you're going to be the next night? And I really think that's something that John's colleagues in other government departments need to step up with. Housing, social protection, health and education all have a role to play here. We're in the middle of a housing crisis, obviously. Accommodation is at a premium, and it's going to be a problem for some time. But we are just asking for people to be coming back into prison if we don't take better care of them when they leave.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sometimes you forget to say the obvious things. On the probation side, we have a third of our budget, 18.5 million, going to support community-based organisations that have been referenced here. We have them throughout the country. They work with about 4,500 of our cases this year, and they do terrific work. We had a recent conference in Croke Park there with all 60 of them, which was terrific, but they are an essential part of that integration process.
Thanks very much. We've 4 or 5 people now who I want to take. So, are you first? Yeah. Okay, is there? Okay, sorry, well, you go first.
Yeah. I got sentenced in the CCJ, and I'm doing it in the drugs court. I'm working in Sale, and I work with Brio, and I find the Brio, it's actually helping me an awful lot. I just want to say, let you know that Brio works. Like, the judges are sending the women into the prisons on a pact where the drugs court is just, it's good. Like, it's better than prison. You can make a life out of it, you know. I started at bronze, I'm up to silver now. So I just like to say, that I'm doing good, you know. I'm a year now clear as well, so thank you.
Hi everyone, Grace, I'm coordinator of the Real Problem and Sale project, proud to be. I've right here women's agenda today, and I think my question is more aimed at John actually rather than Caron, and I suppose as well I want to really acknowledge Governor Galgi in like the kind of brave decisions he's made in terms of allowing peers into the Docus and how successful that's been, so thank you very much, among other measures such as keeping the school open. So thanks very much. But John, we're really curious to know what your commitment, like budget-wise, nationally is to women's healthcare. So in terms of HRT and access to appropriate medication in relation to menopause, and in relation to access to choice for women who maybe don't want to be pregnant and find themselves in custody. Obviously that's not a planned event to be in custody for most women. And in our experience, they're not things that are on the dialogue in terms of healthcare in custody. So that's my question.
It's probably more a question for Caron, actually.
I can't answer specifics. I'm looking for Martin, but it wouldn't be fair for Martin to answer. But I think like the one thing I do know in relation to the Docus is just the incredibly committed healthcare team that are there, and women are entitled to equal access to healthcare in the same way people are on the outside. So if there are any specific issues, happy to deal with them. But there is an equivalence of care, and we strive for more than an equivalence of care. And I know there's hugely committed nurses and doctors working within the prison to support the women in any way we can.
Thank you. Okay, this.
My name's Patrick. I work for Caron after prison. You were talking about people coming out, having social welfare sorted out and having accommodation, stuff like that, and that doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. I think there's still only one resettlement officer in Mountjoy at the minute. So there's over 800 people in Mountjoy and there's one resettlement officer. So Care After Prison kind of has to pick up that end. So we know that people are not getting payments and haven't got medical cards. But I'm leaving Care After Prison next week, so I won't get into trouble for all the stuff I'm not saying.
You're not going to get into trouble anyway.
Look, I've met you, Karen, absolutely. And Governor Galgi is someone that pushes for everything for the women, but the women have more barriers than men have and should have more resources, and they just don't. Myself and Grace, we go into the prison every week, and you're going home and you just don't forget what's going on in there. Women really need more resources. You have overcrowding, but you don't have more resources given to the women or given to the men. So definitely people, not everyone has a payment coming out. I'm telling you that now because I don't have to worry about it anymore. Definitely people don't have accommodation coming out with one resettlement officer in the whole of Mountjoy. For the past month, 6 weeks, it's just not working out, and eventually it's going to cost someone to die or whatever. Mark worked with me as a probation officer, so Tusnewit, it's great, isn't it? I can say what I want. Tusnewit, have you been out to Tusnewit? You have, yeah. So I could do with a bit more resources out there as well. Programs, they're struggling to deliver programs. The Paul are really good at what they do, but they are struggling to deliver programs out there. There's ideas that have been come up, they just haven't got the money for it. So if you are throwing money around, throw it out there. Yeah, that's kind of me.
Okay, would anybody like to reply? Yeah, there's somebody down. Yeah, there's somebody down the back.
I'm Melanie. I'm with Community Foundation Ireland. We're very proud to have partnered with IPRT for a number of years on the PIPS monitoring. And a few of you have spoken about some issues with staffing in terms of opening new accommodation, in terms of being able to provide the mental health supports needed. So I'm just wondering a little bit more about the extent of the staffing the extent of the staffing on actually implementing some of the pieces that are being that are being monitored, and any other major challenges that you see to implementation. And this is for anyone on the panel and actually anyone in the room, because this room is full of experts from different areas.
I mean, I'm sorry, are we going to take another? I'm going to try and answer that question. To an extent, I mean, resources are a challenge right across the public sector. We've been doing our level best in terms of recruitment. We had an ambition to have 40 in every class this year. Our first two classes had 8 and 10. Our third 27 and our next 27, so it's very difficult to get people in. Once you get people in, we have very high retention rates, which are great. So we have an ambition to recruit 250 staff this year and more next year. But the biggest issue really in the prison service in terms of service provision are the number of staff who have to leave Dave and Martin and Eddie's prison every morning to assist escorts. So all things being equal, if we had the resources we ought to have in our prisons, we'd be able to provide an excellent service, and we have incredible schools, incredible work training, incredible in-reach services. But if you have to give 20 or 30 staff from your prison every morning to cover escorts, then your ability to provide services and to meet our level of ambition in terms of care and rehabilitation is severely impeded. So we have gotten extra resources this year to recruit 100 staff to support escorts, and we'll be certainly looking for that magnitude next year again, because what we want to do is to keep the staff we have in our prisons to provide the very best service we can to people in our care. And I think your point is very well made in relation to the women's prison. We don't have sufficient resources, notwithstanding the incredible work, and particularly the work of the school. I was in there this week, 97 women registered and attending school every week. But we can do more, and we should aim to do more, and we want to do more, and that's certainly our ambition.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're just coming up towards the end, so there's somebody in the back there.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, can you give them?
Hi, I'm Linda. I'm a solicitor with the court service. But I was, as a parent myself, I was saddened by Mark's story that he, as a child, he started out in the prison system. I don't know what age, but at 15. And I suppose that's what I'm taking from this: is how do we prevent certain communities from, going into that cycle in the first place? How do we do that? And even, I suppose it's more a political statement, but I think we need to support women better in this country. We need more child-friendly policies. If you look at the Scandinavian countries that have sort of egalitarian rights, for women for parents going on maternity leave, they're shared between both parents, and women are fully paid throughout their parental leave. And in this country that doesn't happen. Women, single parents, are often stuck in a poverty trap. Now, I don't know if that's Mark's experience or Mark's community's experience, but it's, they're not supported, they can't go out to work, they don't have, childcare, we know the cost of childcare in this country, and it holds women back, and that's just one policy that's just not good enough. And and that's where it all starts. We need to start at where the children are at, and help the children, help their parents, and stop that cycle in the first place. It's fine to talk about rights, when, my experience with the courts is that vulnerable people, I work in the wards office, are very well supported by the court service, but it's preventing people getting into that cycle of crime in the first place. And my experience of the family law courts as a solicitor is just pretty awful. Women trying to get child support in this country, it's just, it's really not good enough. And, other countries take child support much more seriously. The family law courts are being reformed, that is happening, but it's just not good enough. And our supports for women generally in this, I feel, need to be improved. And that lady was talking about how women are treated, the undignified way they're treated in prisons, how they're separated from their families. That's cruelty. I'm aware of a mother who was sent to prison, and her relatively newborn baby was taken away from her, and that's not, that is cruelty. and it's not just on the mother, it's on the child. How do you do that in this country to a child? And it was done on a whim of a male judge in this case, but and she was looking at other parents who other mothers in that prison who had their babies. So it was just seemed to be down to discretion. There's no real policy about that. But I just think we need to change our policies and support women better in this country. It's a political statement, but that's what I'm looking at. And I suppose to finish on the restorative justice, I am very interested in restorative justice and how, because the wards is changing now and the Assisted Decision Making Act, where vulnerable adults are giving them more agency over their own lives, and we need to start, how do you give young adults, young children more agency, that there is no victimless crime, that they need to make, be supported making choices, making good decisions, and how do we support children and parents to help avoid the prison system in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for one final point. Did you want to? Okay. Oh.
Thanks. Aisling O'Donnell, Maynooth University Professor of Education and also Vice Chair of the Board to the IPRT. So unsurprisingly, my question is going to be about education, and I'm interested to know how you conceptualise and think about the role of education, because I think Ireland's had a very interesting history in offering a very broad, diverse education, and the opportunities for the kinds of experiences of feeling valued, of having dignity and respect and so on with those relationships, and the opportunities to explore different areas. And of course, we've got a highly diverse prison population as well, some people in for very long stretches of time, others shorter, some maybe doing postgraduate degrees and so on. So it's complex. Now I know that there's a prison and education task force being set up, and I am concerned that perhaps education might be reduced, as it has in much of society, to education for employment purposes. So I'm just wondering about how you imagine the role of education in prison.
Okay, Mark is in the game first.
Thank you. It's a critical question, and in the Inspectorate of Prisons, we're not experts in education, but we recognise how central it is, particularly to prospects for reintegration into society in the broader sense. So what we've done is we've concluded a memorandum of agreement with the inspectors of the Department of Education. So for example, during the last two inspections that we've done, we brought in two inspectors from the Department of Education to engage directly with the teachers and to look at the quality of education per se, over and above and beyond the question of vocational training. So it is absolutely central, I absolutely agree with you. The other thing that comes across very clearly from our recent inspection work, we've been carrying out surveys of the prison population using secure tablet computers inside the prison. Around about a third of the prison population in each prison have responded, and almost without exception, those who are involved in education value it massively. It comes out very high in terms of our survey results. But the real issue is, as I already touched on, access, and what is the capacity to provide education in prisons, and that will continue to be a focus of the Inspectorate. And I very much hope our report on education and training will also add to that debate when it's published.
Is there anyone else?
I'll just come in very briefly, and it's really just give a reassurance. That education is not just about employment, and we have the most incredible skills in Ireland, in my view, and they rival anything that's been offered in the community, because they are places where people feel valued, where people feel wanted, where people feel included, and it's not the tangible certificates, it's the sense of agency and the self-worth. that's the most incredible thing that our education units provide. So actually the intention around the education task force, and this is something I've been looking at, is really about actually trying to maximise how our education and work training areas work together so that we can give tangible employment skills to people leaving custody. And we're talking about things like apprenticeships, so really tangible. You getting people to get a really good skill that they can gain while they're in custody, and then a pathway to support and release, as people go out. So it's not about reducing what we're doing in terms of education, it's anything but.
Well, on that very positive note, I'm going to finish up as somebody who taught in the prison system for 14 years. I'm delighted to hear that, so I'm going to take advantage of it and wrap up there. But before we finish, I'd like to invite Molly Joyce to give us a closing remark on today's launch of our report. Molly is actually Executive Director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust, having joined the organisation in November 2020 as Legal and Public Affairs Manager and Deputy Director.
Thank you, Cormac. Thanks, Cormac. I will try to keep my remarks brief, but I have a lot of people to thank, so please do bear with me. First of all, I want to very much thank all of our speakers today. So, President of the District Court, His Honour Judge Kelly, Karen McCaffrey, Mike Wilson, Mark Kelly, John O'Callaghan and Paul Grace. Thank you so much for making time from your very busy schedules to attend today's event and for engaging so thoroughly with the PIPS 2022 report. And also for your willingness to listen to the report's recommendations and analysis and engage in conversations like we've had today. I think listening to the conversation today, it's clear that there are some areas of disagreement, but there's also a lot of areas of consensus. It's also clear that a lot of the issues we're talking about are very complex. We've heard mention of the cross-agency, interdepartmental working, staffing pressures across the public sector and the housing crisis, all of which mean that some of the solutions are not straightforward. However, what's very encouraging to IPRT is that there does appear to be a widespread and shared interest, I think, in improving Ireland's penal system and creating a model of international best practice that we can all be proud of. And that is ultimately what the PIPS project is about. I think having that shared interest and commitment is not something that can be taken for granted, having looked at other countries and myself having worked in other countries where that's not always the case. And my ultimate hope is that this report and this event today will help to continue to build consensus and momentum for reform. In IPRT, we are particularly delighted to have seen great engagement with the PIPS project across the key criminal justice stakeholders for another year. And again, we very much appreciate the willingness that agencies have shown in responding to the report each year, but also in facilitating IPRT's work on it. In particular, I want to thank those key agencies, namely the Irish Prison Service, the Probation Service, the National Forensic Mental Health Service and the Office of the Inspector of Prisons, and the individuals within them who have helped facilitate IPRT in accessing certain data. Without that access to data, the level of analysis and detail that you see in the PIPS report would simply not be possible. So thank you very much for that, and thank you to the staff in those services who provided that information. I'd further like to thank Dr. Cormac Behan for so expertly chairing today's event, and also for his chairing of the PIPS advisory group. We are very grateful and very lucky to have Cormac's insights and expertise guiding the work of the PIPS project. And we again thank him for all of the time he has given to us as we work and finalise on the PIPS 2022 report. Other members of the PIPS advisory group deserve mention, that is Ashton Golden, Professor Kathleen Lynch, John Ward and Christy Wood. Again, we thank you for your support, your time and your willingness to share your insights at all stages of this project. When talking about support, I must also mention the chair of IPRT's board, Dr. Seamus Taylor, and the former chair of the PIPS advisory group, Professor Ashton O'Donnell. Both of you have played a huge role in supporting the PIPS vision from its very inception, and you have played a very big role in making this annual report and event the success that it is. One of the long-term goals of the PIPS project is to engage people with experience of the penal system as co-creators and monitoring progress into the future. While staff capacity and resources makes this a challenge for us, we have attempted this year to go at least some way to the goal by carrying out informal peer discussions with women with experience from imprisonment. These sessions guided the Spotlight Standard on Women in the Penal System, as Pamela mentioned, and I want to sincerely thank the women who took part in these sessions and the Cell Bria programme for making this engagement possible. Your insights from the insights of these women ensure that the report places the focus where it needs to be and further adds a sense of urgency to the work we are doing in this area and the need for action. I also just want to thank many of the, Paul in particular and others for sharing their own experience of overcrowding and what it actually means to be in an overcrowded prison. It's something that's asked a lot when I'm talking to people, and I think it's really hard to actually get across what it means, but that whole point around the dignity, the inhumane treatment, how it dehumanises people and makes it that much more difficult for people to actually move on from their offending behaviour is really important to always keep in our minds and to keep in our sights. The event today and this report would obviously not be possible without the generous funding of our Donor Advised Family Fund, facilitated through Community Foundation Ireland. I want to sincerely thank these funders and CFI for the support shown to this project over the years and the belief in the importance of facilitating this annual monitoring of the penal system. Other funders who make the work of IPRT possible must also be thanked. They are the Department of Justice, Pobble, the Catherine Harrow Foundation, Portuguese, the Congregation of the Sisters of Mercy Solidarity Committee, the St Stephen's Green Trust, IRA, Open Doors Initiative, and of course Community Foundation Ireland. Quite a lot of funders, a very small team. So thank you all so much, because without your funding, obviously none of this will be possible. Finally, I want to say thank you to all of the IPRT staff, Aisling, Helen, Michelle, Pamela and Paula, for all their work in pulling together today's report and launch, as well as our volunteer Laura, who has been helping us out today. And of course, I also want to thank Saoirse Brady, our Executive Director, who is currently on maternity leave, for her leadership, especially in the groundwork for this project, which started well before she went on maternity leave. As you all know, IPRT is a very small team, and reports and events such as these are only really possible because every staff member is so committed to the work we do and is always so willing to go above and beyond. In particular, I want to say a special thanks to Pamela Drumgoole, who led the authorship of this year's report. The final report that you will read shows a high level of research and analysis that is down in no small part to Pamela's input into the project and her dedication to the PIPS project. I should also mention Michelle Martin, who did the initial kind of work on the PIPS project and setting that vision, so thank you so much. The report, as mentioned, is now online, and I would encourage all of you to engage with it over the coming weeks and months. Thank you again so much for coming to the launch of PIPS 2022, and I hope to catch up with as many of you as possible after this when we'll have some lunch. And we do have one more speaker just briefly, so don't start standing up just yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. So finally, I'd like to introduce and invite Dr. Seamus Taylor, Chairperson of the IPRT, to conclude proceedings. As Chairperson of the IPRT, Seamus has been a long-standing supporter of Progress in the Penal System project, and alongside other board members and my predecessors on the PIPS System Advisory Group, he has championed its vision since its inception. Seamus.
Thank you very much, Cormac. And I'm not going to speak for very long. I'm going to say one set of thank yous, and I need to make one announcement. And I don't want to hold you between your not staying here and getting your lunch. So I want to say thanks, and I want to make this announcement. In my view, I just want to thank all of you again for attending today and engaging with the PIPS project both today and over time. I think in PIPS we have an incredibly valuable resource for better evidence-based penal policy making, and ultimately for better prisons for all, for the staff who govern them, who work within them, and those detained within them. So I think it's an incredible resource that we've been able to realise in partnership over the past 6 years. None of this would be possible without our generous funders, the donor-assisted funding through the Community Foundation of Ireland, and that has to be really emphasised. The vision that we had would have just remained a vision or a dream. It would be nothing without your willingness to actually invest in us. And I want to just reiterate the thanks that Molly made to the advisory group, to Cormac, who led it excellently, to Aisling, to Professor Kathleen Lynch, to John and to Christy. You have done an excellent job on this year's PIPS report, and most of all to Pamela, who has done an excellent job of authorship under the leadership of Saoirse and Molly. And one thing, I didn't intend to say this, but when people were speaking earlier, the President of the District Court, Judge Kelly, talked about problem-solving courts. I have experience of developing them in Britain. in the area of domestic violence, going back to 2004 when I was Director of Equality at the DPP's office, and we had a project with the court service. We piloted 3 domestic violence courts across different parts of Britain, one in an inner part of London, one in Birmingham, and one in rural Wales. And it was just one day a week on a Wednesday, the local district, or what's called there the Magistrates Court, became a domestic violence court. And it was a centre of expertise, problem solving for that day. The judge had been trained around domestic violence issues. There were social workers present, Women's Aid were present, Refuge was present, Housing Service was present, and the whole thing worked. The pilots were deemed to be successful, such that the Home Office funded a rollout of this across the 42 shires in Britain. And domestic violence courts run to this day in Britain on a problem-solving model like the drugs court in Ireland. And if anybody wants to get in touch, the same woman who set it up in 2004, Jude Watson, is still involved in running it to this day, and I could introduce people to her. But it is a model that works, and it itself was informed by a court in New York called Red Hook, which was a community court. It was wider than just a specific theme. So I didn't intend to mention that at all, but I really would endorse it based on the practical experience of working in it. Now, to the brief announcement. As people have probably heard and people have probably noticed, babies are in the air in the IPRT at present, and our Executive Director, Saoirse, is on maternity leave, and we really wish Saoirse all the best for her period of maternity leave up to September. And Molly, our acting Executive Director, is about to go on maternity leave in about approximately a week's time. And we wish Molly all the very best. And Molly has done an absolutely tremendous job in acting up as Executive Director. And we are delighted that we have secured the expertise of Kathleen O'Mara, organisational consultant, who will cover as the IPRT team leader for a period of approximately 11 weeks until Saoirse returns in early September. Kathleen knows the organisation really well. She's worked hand in glove with us in developing our strategic plan over the past year, and Kathleen brings very significant NGO leadership to the role. She's been involved in a range of organisations in Ireland, including at a very senior level the Irish Cancer Society. She's been involved in policy influencing and indeed has significant experience from the political arena. So Kathleen will be supported over the 11 weeks by our excellent staff team, and a subgroup of the board of IPRT will be available throughout the summer period. So we just wanted to convey to you that we will have a seamless flow, and IPRT will continue to deliver at the high standards that we set ourselves and that you expect of us. So that's as much as I was going to say. The final thing, it's a thought that came into my mind sitting there and listening to the judge, listening to the Deputy Secretary General, and listening to Caron. We call this, oh no, the screen has gone off, progress in the penal system. In a way, maybe in time, somebody should have an ambition for progress in the public sector system. Because I was thinking, so much of what you do, you are responsive. You don't have control about who comes through your door, but you are, in a sense, third level policy making. And I often set an essay for my students in college. The best criminal justice policy is progressive social policy. And that starting, maybe we need a national equality strategy, anti-poverty, a progressive education policy, a decent housing for all, accessible healthcare. And if those bedrock services were available, maybe people who are speaking here today would not have come in contact with the system either at all or as frequently as they have done. So I'll just leave you with that thought. And I'll